Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Awakening Report. I'm your host, Dr. Doug Hamp. Great to be with you. I want to let you know, thank you for being a patron of this show. Really appreciate it. If you want to become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/Doug Hamp, and you can join there. Little as $2 a month or whatever you want to give. Well, it really does help. Appreciate it. Keeps the lights on, helps pay the kids' tuition and all that other stuff. So thank you very much. I have a special guest on today, and he is going to tell us about the War of the Words and how there's a connection with the Rephaim and some royal kings. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Judd Burton from Burton Beyond. Hey, brother, it's great to see you.
Good to see you too.
Yeah, so you got me intrigued here. What is the War of the Words? What is this research that you've been doing? Kind of tell us about it.
Sure. Well, I thought that War of the Words would be a little more exciting than a preliminary linguistic analysis on the relationship between the words Rephaim and blah, blah, blah. So I went with War of the Words. But well, first of all, I should probably start at the beginning of the rabbit trail, right? I woke up in the middle of the night at about 3 o'clock in the morning about a week ago, and I had this image of me back in the lecture hall talking to my students in one of my world civilization classes. And one of the fun little exercises that I used to do with them, or illustrations rather, to show how languages change, in particular Indo-European languages, I would do these little comparisons with words, and it just so happens that the word for king was one of those words that I would use to illustrate the comparison. Having studied languages yourself, you're probably familiar with the concept of Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European, but basically for the listeners, it's just Proto-Indo-European is kind of a reverse engineered language. It's a language or family of languages rather that linguists believe originated in the region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So we're kind of talking Central and West Central Asia. So what I would do in these, as waves of migration occurred from this region, people took their language with them to the various parts of the Eurasian continent. And so you can still find similarities between certain core words, kinship words and object words and position words. They usually find a lot of similarity in terms of the structure and the sound of words. And so king was always my go-to word to illustrate this to my students. For instance, once waves of migration began to move into South Asia from this region of Asia, for instance, the Sanskrit word, which was the ancient Indian language, the Sanskrit word for king was Rajan. And of course, you have variations of that, like in Hindi, Raja, and so on and so forth. By comparison, you had people that moved to the west as well from this region and ended up in the Italian peninsula, so that in Italic languages such as Latin, you have the word rex for king. So you have that initial morpheme similarity, and not only a morpheme, but a cognate, which is a shared idea between words.
And of course you have Ray and all these other variations.
Exactly.
Regnus, right? I mean, the variations on this theme. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and even the Germanic languages were affected by this. In English, we retain words like regal and royal that are all related. They're all cognates to these concepts from Proto-Indo-European. And so this is what wakes me up in the middle of the night, and I start thinking about the work that scholars like Dr. Amar Anus and Dr. Heiser, yourself, Derek and Sharon Gilbert have done on the comparison of the word Rephaim, which students of the Bible will be familiar with as one of the tribes of giants. That word and proximate words that is in the ancient Near East that are very similar to it in form and function. And we can flesh this out as the program goes on, but some of those words are Akkadian Rop, which is associated with dead kings and their Apsu, or the abyss.
Right.
And of course, the material for the Rosh Hashanah material, the Ugaritic text from Phoenician culture, dealing with their funerary cult. You have a similar, Rapi that occurs amongst that, which is an allusion to their long dead, not only their long dead kings, but the rites that go along to placating them within their religion.
Right. Yes.
And I found it interesting, that both in the Mesopotamian context and in the Ugaritic context, particularly in Mesopotamian, that word Rapi or Rabu means prince, and it shows up in proper names like Hammurabi and Amraphel.
And that's the same root as rabbi, right?
That's right.
It just means great, right? Great one, or
exactly,
something like that, right?
Exactly.
So, right.
Yeah. And that may,
these are the nerds in us are coming out.
Exactly. So I cautioned somebody the other day about, I realize that linguistic analysis can get kind of dry at some points. There were a few times that I wanted to fall asleep in some of my linguistics classes anyways. So, but once you begin to see the meta picture, when you do these sorts of comparisons, you can tease out some really interesting stuff. And for students of the Bible and biblical languages, this is just sort of one of those things that was sort of hiding in plain sight that I didn't even, consider. And so again, I'm laying in my bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking, is there a connection here? Because I just wrote down the words that I could think of in Indo-European languages, just sort of writing it out on the notepad on my phone, and then wrote down all of the Hebrew, Ugaritic, and the Akkadian stuff that I remembered. And I set it aside, went back to sleep, wanted to, get a fresh start the next day and really hit the ground running. And man, I did a survey, just the briefest sort of cursory survey of Indo-European words, and was just astounded of not only this cognate relationship that you see in Eurasian languages, in particular words for king or ruler, and that they share not always an initial, but mostly an initial morpheme with the R vowel component within the word. And so I began to wonder.
I'm tracking with you. just to give people, let's back up for just a quick second, because linguistics can be one of those things that, we get the deer in the headlights
absolutely
effect here. And so just for people that maybe aren't so savvy on languages, understand kind of like what Latin is to Spanish, Italian, Romanian, French, right? So, I studied Spanish a lot, and then I studied one semester of French. And based on those two, I spent a summer in Europe, and I spent a summer in France, and then I went over to Italy, and I was able to bluff my way in Italian. Okay, and the Italians were incredibly gracious with me.
Sure,
I should add that. Okay,
yeah.
But I could still kind of bluff my way that I could pick between something in Spanish or French. I'm like, well, because they're very, very similar. They're not the same, but they are similar. And the same thing happens with what we call Proto-Semitic, right? So as you said, it's kind of this, this reverse engineered language that we don't have an actual source of it. But looking at Ugaritic, Hebrew, Phoenician, Akkadian, we can, by we, I mean, various scholars are putting together these basic ideas of what they think the original Semitic language looked like. And so you're doing the same thing here,
right?
And based on Indo-European languages. So, Yeah,
Well,
very
and
cool.
because languages are not static entities,
That's
they
right.
change over space and time. You can make those logical leaps backwards, and there's really kind of a mathematics, to doing that. It's I always thought of it because I also come from a music background. For the longest time, I thought that's what I was going to do. And so I understood, music theory and composition. And so it sort of works, mathematically. There's that mathematic component of music. Linguistics is kind of the same way, particularly the comparative and historical linguistics. But what's interesting about the Proto-Indo-European stuff is that the Proto-Indo-European heartland that J.P. Mallory and a lot of other Indo-Europeanists and linguists and scholars sort of dubbed as the region that this came from. The southern end of that includes eastern Turkey and northern Mesopotamia. And when you start to consider that, there were groups, notably people like the Sumerians, that we're not altogether convinced were indigenous to Mesopotamia in the first place. There's some people, some linguists, that think that they actually came from the Indo-European region, and that's why you see, even between Semitic languages and Proto-Indo-European, or Indo-European languages rather, you do see, it's not uncommon to see some borrow words and similarities and cognates between those language families.
Right. And for people that are not familiar with Sumerian, which I like to geek out on as well, that
Absolutely.
this is basically, we're talking about the region of where Abraham grew up. Okay. So, but before him, all right. So probably a millennium before him, somewhere.
If not, yeah, sure. If not more, yeah. Which again is sort of.
And what's interesting is that Sumer, right? Sumer is Shinar, right? So
that's
in
right.
Hebrew, Shumer, Shinar, which is Shnei Nerot, which is the two rivers, which means Mesopotamia, right? Which
exactly.
means the land of the two rivers, right? It's just a big circle, right? So this is why these are all so significant and interesting, because it all started there. We know that that's where Nimrod got his start, and the false religions of Babel started there. That is why this is so significant, in case people didn't pick that up. All right, cool.
Well, sure. And, and I mean, even, if linguists could, this is just sort of a gut feeling of mine. It's not something that I've been able to flesh out on my own, but some talented linguist, a Champollion or Michael Ventris, somebody in their study on a weekend is going to crack this language code, about this, perhaps there was a share language before even Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic that was mutually intelligible, and that's why you end up having those kinds of share words, which, for the purposes of our discussion today, is kind of, it's kind of amazing, because this concept that we're getting at here about king or ruler and its association with some kind of a supernatural evil, and even the concept of an oppressive autocratic ruler, maybe even far older than either Proto-Indo-European or Proto-Semitic.
Wow, I mean, that's really amazing that you're suggesting that. I was just thinking about different kings. So I'm coming off a book high, right? I just wrote a book, Corrupting the Image 2.
An excellent one, by the way.
Thank you. I came up with a subtitle. I'm pretty excited about it.
I saw that. Yeah.
Hybrids, Hades, and the Mount Hermon connection. So
you can't go wrong. Can't go wrong with alliteration.
Those are always fun. But I started digging into kind of similar type material, or similar ideas anyway. And it's astounding when you start taking these things back. And I totally geeked out, because I was like, this is so cool, right? And it's hard to share that. It's hard to share with, let's call it the average reader, whatever that is, that doesn't have the background in languages. And look, there's a lot of things that I don't have a background in, right? So I need the popular mechanics version of it, right? And so that's kind of what we're trying to do here, is to give people the popular mechanics version of these, sometimes very complex relationships, and you have to go back and look at these languages that take a while to learn. But it's exciting because then you start to see these connections, and you're like, wow, the Bible is not just something that's an island unto itself, that so many skeptics want us to believe, that the Bible just, some guy just wrote this thing and it has nothing to do with anything. It's not related to science or to history or to language. And yet we begin to find that it's at the very heart of it, once you can start making those linguistic connections like you're doing.
Sure. Yeah, and when you have these closed parameter older languages like Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Semitic, and perhaps even a theoretical one that's older than that, a language or a group of languages, multiple dialects that were mutually intelligible, that begins to make stories from Genesis, like the pre-Tower of Babel societies that existed, that people spoke one language, that begins to take on the hues of reality. And I used to often wonder about that and muse about it in my linguistics classes when the professors would give lectures about Proto-Indo-European. So yeah, this for scholars, this is complete geek territory. I mean, we eat this sort of stuff up, and for those of us who study these sort of strange topics, like the Watchers and the Nephilim and the Rephaim, and we begin to see possible tie-ins, then the lights begin to come on for us, and that's what we want to convey that to people. It's one thing for scholars to be in their resonating box, but we also have a duty, particularly scholars who are have faith. We have a duty to share that with the rest of Christendom and of course the world too.
Oh, that's very cool. Well, so what is the connection? You've teased us a little bit here. So how do we go from, what'd you say, ragus, or of course rex in Latin, but what was the Sanskrit word for?
The Sanskrit word was Raja.
Raja. Okay, Raja. Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's incredibly similar. So have you found a connection between that and what a proto language?
Well, the cognate here is sort of it's sort of the door to this rabbit hole. And looking at it in the context of the Rephaim, there's clearly this idea, even in I think about the Genesis 14 war, between the 5 kings and the 4 kings on the one hand. One of the indications in that text is that perhaps the kings, the 4 kings were, or excuse me, the kings on the region of the Dead Sea were Rephaim, because the Rephaim are mentioned in that text. And this seems to be another, it's the motif of the oppressive, usurping king. Also, continues on in other passages, notably with Og. References to Og of Bashan. And in general, when you look at the antediluvian giants, I mean, clearly they were autocratic and oppressive, and didn't have the best interest at heart of humanity, because they finished off all of their resources. So this idea of just like everything the demonic realm does, is it takes what God lays out or makes and turns it into a terrible parody.
Yes.
A dark mirror reflection. So in the case, even the concept of Yahweh, the sovereign of the created universe, this idea of taking a just, perfect, and benevolent ruler and then flipping it on its head as this oppressive, autocratic ruler, seems to be that's the idea that's carried along in the cognate, in the various words that spread beyond the ancient Near East and the Proto-Indo-European heartland. And so the argument that I'm making is that that's by design. That's a manipulation of knowledge and language, which is very much in character with the Watchers and with the pre-flood giants, and that legacy continues on after the flood as well, clearly.
Wow.
And so I don't think that that's by, I mean, even the concept of kings and rulers, that are divinely appointed to rule over, even in Christendom, the idea that kings are divinely appointed to rule over, at their discretion, the people under them. And even today, Kim Jong-un, when you talk to survivors of the North Korean regime, he identifies himself as a god, or as God. So
you kind of have to.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
In an absolutist system like that, you do. But those ideas are not recent. They survive into modernity, but they're not recent. They're ancient and primeval.
Right.
And there's a language trail that I think demonstrates that. So, even if people, like I've said before, even if you strip away the theology, the religious backdrop of the story of the Watchers and the Giants, they leave a historical, mythological, anthropological, and dare I say, archaeological trail behind them.
Wow.
And so that same sort of cultural linguistic evidence they're trailing behind. Here again, I'm using anthropological models to study the world of the giants, in this case the Rephaim.
Wow.
And so this is the most recent of it. I mentioned the cursory survey of words that I did in Eurasian Languages, and I came up with a list. And again, I'm probably just scratching the surface, because we're talking about thousands upon thousands of languages. I came up with a list of 80 words containing that R vowel morpheme. And I say R vowel morpheme because even in some Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European words, and notably in Semitic words, we know that the farther back you go, the more fast and loose you can play with the vowels. And of course, you know this, having studied Hebrew and Semitic tongues. So that R vowel morpheme is very prevalent in words for king and ruler, in these cognate words over space and time.
Wow. Can you give us a few examples of those?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah.
But before I do this, I also want to preface, sort of continuing on with this idea of the Rephaim as these oppressive rulers, and just the giants and Watchers in general as oppressive rulers. The earliest civilizations, almost without fail, were these theocratic monarchies. In other words, the religious and political systems were the same functionary. They were the same entity, essentially. And you did have these autocratic kings who believed that they were either gods themselves, or that they were emissaries of the gods. This, I believe, being an idea because the first of these oppressive kings that they had on the earth literally were these celestial and semi-divine beings, the Watchers and their progeny in later generations of giants. That again, that sort of ties it in to this idea that it's a very antique and primeval idea, and a modified body of knowledge. But just to give you some samplings of these words, you don't even have to go starting in the ancient world to other regions that are proximate, like the Hittite world. The Hittites borrowed a lot of words. Anatolian languages borrowed a lot of words from Mesopotamia. Rabu was one of those. Now I found this very interesting too. Most people will be familiar with King Minos from the story of the Labyrinth and the Minotaur. It's where the Minoan civilization, where Arthur Evans got the name for Minoan. Now we actually do have a a literary reference to King Minos from. We have an example of Linear A Greek, the sort of Proto-Greek that the Minoan spoke. And I believe this is on the Phaistos disc, if I'm not mistaken, but it clearly references King Minos as Ruja Mino. And there again is the Proto-Indo-European stamp, and that morpheme of the R and the vowel referencing an ancient king. In the Gothic tongues that the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths spoke, some other tribes like the Alans and the Sarmatians, the word for king was rex. In Irish Gaelic, it's ri. In Azerbaijani, it's krol. In Bengal, it's Raja, which would be related to the Sanskrit Hindi language family. In the Basque tongue, which is an Iberian language, Erega. Bosnian, Kralju. Bulgarian, Krol. Burmese, Bu-Rain. Catalan, which is another Iberian tongue, Ray. Corsican is Ray. Croatian is Kralj. Czech is Kral. Esperanto, which is a kind of amalgam language. It was kind of an invention of the 19th century. There was a stab at creating a modern, mutually intelligible language, kind of like Latin was in the early modern period. The word is rega, and it's largely based on Romance languages. French, of course, that you mentioned, is Roy. Galician, which is related, is Ray. Lots of occurrences of Raja and variants of that in Southern and Southeast Asia. Hindi, Raja, that I mentioned a moment ago. Italian is Ray. Kurdish is Karal. Latvian is Rawlis. Macedonian is Kral. Malay is Raja. Nepali is Raja. Polish is Krol. Portuguese, another Iberian tongue, is Ray. Romanian, Rege. Russian, Koroy. Serbian, Kralju. Slovak, Kral. Slovenian, Kralj. Spanish, Ray. Tamil, Raja. Turkish, Kral. Ukrainian, Korol. Welsh, which is an ancient British tongue, Brennan. And that's just a few examples.
So you're suggesting that this may be related to the word Rephaim. Is that what I understand? Okay.
Yes.
So and that word, there's two different ways it could go, right? One is it's from the word Rapha, which means like a doctor or
a physician,
a physician, medicine of some sort. And then the other proposed root is Rabu, right, which is great, right? Is that right? So
yes,
how would you go from that to then something that's RG, like how, or RX, RG? How do you, or it's kind of that Rech?
Well, the thing that I'm concerned with is the R vowel morpheme and its occurrence in this specific cognate, this word that means king or ruler. Statistically, you just can't call that an accident.
Okay. Well, certainly it looks like they have a common source. I'm just wondering, from what I understood you were saying is that this may be coming from Rephaim. And so I'm trying to see how we go from a kind of a Rabbah or Rapha type root to something that's now RG. Because, I mean, it's nice to have, certainly in Semitic languages, you have 3 root letters most of the time. 2 of them are still pretty good. One I find pretty hard to make a definitive statement because one letter is one letter. although I'm definitely on track with you, because I mean, obviously Rabu is great, and that was used as kings, and it could be used for the Rephaim.
Sure. Right.
So
And if that's
yeah,
a derivative of Mesopotamian,
mhm,
those languages, particularly the Akkadian and Sumerian stuff, is older.
right,
So,
yeah,
and those words are, you know, even those words are combinations. You have two morphemes there, basically the R vowel and the P or B sound, which is basically the same thing, because one is soft, one is hard, because you're making it with the same
right.
parts of your mouth, and that's the Apsu part. So the
So
rulers
you
from.
okay? So it's from Apsu.
Mhm.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Yeah, I hadn't heard that one. Uh, do you know who's proposing that? I mean, what is it? Apsu, but where does the R come from? Rabu Apsu, is that the idea?
The R vowel is another cognate, and I want to say that I read that in a paper by Dr. Anus.
Okay.
I'd have to go back and dig it up, and
Yeah,
I'll
I
I'll
understand.
make a note to
Yeah.
do that. I can't bring
Okay.
off the top of my head. I can't think of it, but I
I
think it's
understand.
Dr. Anus.
Okay. Yeah, he's a
Mhm.
great scholar. I mean, there's no
Oh
doubt
yeah,
about it.
it's
Yeah.
fantastic.
Yeah. Interesting. So, yeah, I mean, well, this is really interesting. I'd love to see how you make the connection, because that's always the challenge, is how to get from, it's like, what's the
Right.
bridge, to get from this side to that side. Like there could
Mhm.
be a connection, but we just have to
Mhm.
kind of see what that is, and then,
Well, again,
you
the proximity of the Proto-Indo-European world and the Proto-Semitic world,
right,
is, I mean, diffusion is it's a it's an invariant in cultural development. It
right,
inevitably happens, and loan words are borrowed, and that's another thing that sort of piqued my interest. After I got a good night's sleep, and then woke up the next day and started really plying my trade to this. Um, uh, but yeah, right now, that's why I subtitled my report a
yeah,
preliminary report, because I have
yeah,
just scratched the surface on this thing.
absolutely. So,
Yeah.
do you think that the Rephaim may be the idea behind the kings, like this idea of kingship, may come from Rephaim? Is that what you're
I think
suggesting?
so. I think
Okay.
so, and I think really it's a continuation of the pre-flood stuff. What started with the Watchers and the first generations of the Nephilim. Because that idea of autocratic, usurping, oppressive ruler is very much present. It's implied in the Genesis stuff, but you get a very interesting picture of it in the apocryphal work, like Enoch.
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Wow. Well, this will be really exciting to see kind of where your research takes you, and what conclusions you end up with, because um, there's a lot of threads to follow in this, but it's
Hmm.
very fascinating. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this, right now it's just a short, brief paper that I'm actually going to make available to people, because I really want to get this out.
Hmm.
Whether it may turn into a book, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I thought that this was relevant enough and timely enough and important enough, um, that people in the body of Christ, I think, need to know about it.
Uh-huh.
Because if this idea was a product of a manipulation of culture, a stratagem, that was used by the demonic realm, then that explains why this kind of ruler has been the rule, not to use a pun, rather than the exception
Hmm.
for all of human history.
Wow.
I mean, our things like our republic, you know, uh, imperfect as it is, things like that are the statistical anomaly, not the norm in world politics.
Right. Yeah. Oh, and of course, we're going back to a king when the Antichrist shows up and does his thing.
That's right.
Yeah, he'll
That's
definitely
exactly
be
right.
back on the scene there to
Sure,
take us back to the way things used to be.
sure. Not the
Wow.
good old days.
Yeah. Well, I think what's really interesting about your research is that you are trying to find these bridges between what we find in the biblical data of the Nephilim, the giants, as it were. And then, what is out there in the world? And I think that's probably one of the biggest criticisms that skeptics have of the Bible in general, and especially our kind of work, is like, well, where do you find this stuff? But you begin to find it, but you have to kind of get still and just listen for a while. You have to take time and listen, and it's not always the flashy stuff that's great in a little soundbite, but it's stuff that takes years of research to piece together and say, okay, I think I found something here. And there is evidence. That's what is really exciting. It's not always the flashy stuff that we'd like to have. Here's Tutankhamun's great tomb or something like that.
Right, exactly.
That's the exciting motherlode type stuff. But
exactly, but I mean, it is exciting insofar as that consider how common. I mean, we use the word king, but it's because it's Germanic largely. It's a relic of our influences from Danish and the Scandinavian influence on English. But clearly that these words with the R vowel morpheme are just all over the place. These cognate words for king or ruler, and that's pretty amazing to me. If there, and I believe that there is. I'm trying to demonstrate it, but if there is that connection, and it does, trace back to all the other kinds of pieces of culture that the Watchers and the Nephilim, manipulated. Then the exciting thing is that once again, we've got records of we can trail all of this stuff. We've got records of this because even for dead languages, we have records, of these words, and we've got all these living languages where these words are being used every day. So the evidence is just sort of hiding in plain sight again. It was kind of a, for me, it was kind of a Benjamin Gates national treasure. As much as linguistics can be, it was kind of a moment like that for me.
I wonder if you may want to kind of go back to Sumerian. I find everything kind of goes back there eventually.
Yeah.
But I was just thinking about the word gal in Sumerian. Is big, right? It means big. And so the word for king is lugal.
Lugal, right.
Lugal. And of course, in English, we have regal, right? So, which is obviously cognate to Ray and all those different things, right? So I wonder if maybe the L fell off at some point, and it should take it back to lugal. And of course, we know that L and R are quite interchangeable. Go ask any Japanese.
Sure.
Right. In fact, I think the U.S. military had some code words, where they had to say Lincoln. I think this was on Iwo Jima, right? If you could say Lincoln, then you were American, right?
Right.
Because the Japanese couldn't; they would say Rinken or Rinkren or something.
Right.
And so I wonder, if those could be interchangeable. I'm just hypothesizing here. I'm just spitballing with you, but maybe that would be something to look at. So Lugal, right? Gal, of course, it is related to Rav, but maybe Rav is kind of a dead end. Maybe it's more of Lugal, and then the L falls off at some point. The latter L.
It could be. I was telling, I told a couple of the hosts of the shows I've been on, that I'm not going to discount anything, at this point. I mean, I've sort of learned to do that. I'm not going to say no to anything within reason. So yeah, it's entirely possible. You point out the interchangeability of the R and L sounds. Certainly, and there were a few words that I found that were interesting beyond Indo-European languages that sort of piqued my interest. Of course, the Mycenaean, one of the Mycenaean words for king was Anax, which is similar to Anak, and in fact, there's a whole paper written on that topic. But there are places like Rapa Nui, which is the native name for Easter Island, and there was a cult of their ancient, gigantic, dead ancestor kings on the island. Rapa Nui translates to something like the great people. So there may be all kinds of offshoots that indicate travel and diffusion far beyond the Indo-European Eurasian language
Oh, yeah.
theory. Yeah.
Well, and there's a number of words that actually, started in Sumerian and have made their way. I don't have my list in front of me, unfortunately. But
yeah, where's your Sumerian grammar, Dr. Hamp?
I know, but I mean, there are words that made it all the way from Sumerian into English, and one of them, and I know that comes from, at least from Hebrew, is the word sack, right? A sack lunch, and that comes from Hebrew, right? Sak. So there's a number of words that have made their way, and so that something would come from Sumerian into today is not at all an impossibility. You just have to show. I think you'd have to show somehow that the L, did change to an R at some point. If you could find some cognate language or that word in a cognate, right, that where it changes to an R, then you'd have a really strong case. So regal, lugal, I think that's entirely possible. And the word gal there being the key word. So in Sumerian or in Akkadian, that becomes sharu, right, which is then like Sar Shalom, right, the Prince of Peace, right. So that's for king and or Belu, right. So the king, Bel, like Baal, right. Same idea. So I don't know. Maybe there's something there. Maybe there's not. I don't know. But that's fascinating. I think this is cool.
Yeah. I mean, these are the importance of these kinds of linguistic jumping jacks that we're doing here is because these are the catalysts for considering these kinds of possibilities, and that's what sort of set me down this trail. I mean, I had to dig out my old linguistics papers to sort of reacquaint, because most of the stuff that I usually do anthropologically is within the context of the history of religions or archaeology or the history and anthropology of religion. So I had to go back and reacquaint myself with the mathematics, as it were, of linguistics. It was sort of like riding a bike. It all sort of came back to me, and you sort of do that unconsciously, as when you deal with any language that you're trained in, you sort of do that within the context of that language unconsciously anyway.
Right.
But yeah, it's been really fun. I mean, I feel like it's important work, and I feel blessed by it. But it's I'm preaching to the choir here. I know when you get into this stuff, it's just really we geek out, and it's really fun.
Yeah, it totally is. Yeah. Well, I'm looking forward to just seeing where this takes you. That the Nephilim existed, there's no doubt about it, right? William Winston, the translator of Josephus, said that was the unanimous position of the ancient world.
Absolutely.
Is that you had the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, they came, they mated with the daughters of men, and they created this hybrid race that we know variously as Nephilim, Rephaim, Zamzumim, etc. So these are the various names for these hybridized creatures. And it's really amazing. In fact, when you go back to Ugaritic and you go back to like some of the Rosh Hashanah texts, and you start looking at what was happening at Mount Hermon, there you find that they thought Mount Hermon was a type of Mount Olympus, if you will. And it was both heaven, it was the abode of the gods, but it was also hell, right? And of course, that is evidenced by Jesus taking his disciples to the gate of Hades, right? Yeah. At the base there.
That's why he uses that phraseology about not just the gates of Hades, but I mean the very word that we use for church assembly doesn't just harken back to like the boule and the Athenian assembly, the ecclesia, but it's it also harkens back to the Olympian assembly, the divine council of gods. And Jesus is basically saying, look, you guys messed it up completely. I'm replacing you with my assembly. So I mean, you and I have talked about this before. I mean, the imagery and the phraseology that he uses there at the Caesarea Philippi episode is, I mean, it's so pregnant with meaning, and it would have been even more so for the Jews, the disciples that were with him, the Jews that were within earshot, and probably even some of the Etrurians and the Greco-Romans that were living there.
Wow. No, that is awesome stuff. Yeah, I mean, of course, I wrote about this in my book, so I'm a little bit biased on this particular topic. Sure. But, I mean, that mountain is just so filled with Nephilim stuff, right?
Yeah,
and this is where they came down. This is where they came down. This is where they hatched their whole plan. And then Jesus goes to the top of that mountain, and he transforms himself with, 3 of his disciples. And he's basically doing a shot across the bow. Absolutely. He's saying, look, Satan, you think this is your mountain? I don't think so. This is my mountain, right? That's what's so cool about it. This is my mountain. I'm taking it back. So you better get out of here.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man. Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Burton, for coming on and for sharing these preliminary thoughts and just kind of where you're going. I think people are going to be really excited to see where you go with this. I know I am. And if they're, a little bit on the geeky side, then they'll come out and say, well, come on, tell me more about this.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. But it also gives people a kind of a window into how the research happens, right? Sure. So, it's not just that you woke up and you just had this random idea. It was based on research of understanding languages, making connections, so that then you can take all of this data and then try to connect the dots, and then you begin to see a pattern emerge. And that's where it gets really exciting. So when you begin to see that pattern, you're like, oh, wow, there's something cool here. And I almost think God's just like, I think people like puzzles. I'll give them a bunch of puzzles,
Yeah.
And, I mean, that's essentially what a historian does, is you're trying to connect the dots, right? That's what, to some degree, a linguist or in our case, a biblical research or anthropological researcher, you're just trying to connect the dots and see, does it make sense, right? So you got to go through and check every dot. Like, is this a legitimate dot? Okay, yes. Can I connect it to this other one? Yes. How do I get there? What's the means by which I do that? And so that gives people an insight. Where can they learn more? Is it burtonbeyond.com? Is that?
Yeah, people can go to burtonbeyond.com. They can go to the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. It's TIOBA.org, and you can actually study this stuff with me. I've actually got a special right now on the 12-course certification. I knocked $50 off of it, so it's $150 right now through the end of January. And as I said, I'm finishing up this preliminary report, and I'm going to make that available as a download, a digital download, probably tonight, just for a modest fee, and people can get a more detailed look at this preliminary analysis.
Oh, that is exciting. Well, everybody go to burtonbeyond.com and check out the amazing work that Dr. Burton has done. I hope this has given you a window as to how scholars go about, making some of these connections and making some of the discoveries. Yeah, some of it's tedious, but then when you finally get to that eureka moment, you're like, wow, that was so cool. And somehow it's almost like giving birth. You're like, it was all worth it, right? But in the time, you're like kind of sweating. So, man, this is awesome. Thank you again. God bless you, everybody. Take